Good morning, folks. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining our webinar. I'm sorry we're getting started just a few minutes late. We had a little technical issue we were working through on our end. This meeting is being recorded. The video will be available, and I'll be dropping the link where you can watch that recording into the chat once we get rolling. The video is usually 24 to 48 hours before it does appear at the link in which I'm gonna share with you. To reduce your background noise, all the participants are listening to this webinar in a listen-only mode. If you have questions, please drop those into the chat function, and we have a moderator who will get to those questions as we go along. And if you do lose your Zoom connection, try the following. You can close and reconnect using the meeting link that was shared with you, or you can reboot your computer and reconnect with the meeting link after that. Dana, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Angie, and good morning, everyone. My name is Dana Connors, and on behalf of the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our continuing series of webinars on the subject of bringing broadband to our state, to our communities, to our businesses, and certainly to our homes. I want to give a shout out to our sponsors because they enable us to bring this timely program to your attention. Our sponsors are AT&T and Verizon. Our supporting sponsors are Central Maine Power, MEMIC, and Eaton Peabody Attorneys at Law. Today, we will be focusing on 5G wireless networks, and certainly appropriately titled "The Future is Now," because when it comes to broadband, the future is now. And that's because we all recognize that the value of broadband in our lives and our livelihood is without question. But what needs to be better understood is the challenge of getting it to you. It needs to be, we all need to be reminded perhaps that Maine is the size of the rest of New England states combined when we think of our geography. Maine is also the country's most rural state, according to census, with almost 60% living outside the urban area. So when you think of that, the question may well be, which option works best for you to get the job done? Well, one of those options is the very subject of today's webinar. That is the 5G wireless network. And to present and discuss this promising option, we have assembled a panel of outstanding experts, and we also are led by an outstanding expert when it comes to moderating this session. That person is Jeff Y. Jeff is a partner at Verrill Dana. He co-chairs along with Jim Cohen, the telecommunications group. You also should know that Jeff practices out of the Boston office of Verrill Dana, where he maintains a regional and a national practice representing the wireless companies before FCC and our own state regulatory agency, the PUC. He is also a former commissioner of Massachusetts Department of Telecommunications and Cable. Very similar to our own PUC, but in this case, he focused on telecommunications. He is no stranger to panels, both as a moderator, but also as a participant. So it is with pleasure that I introduce to you and to welcome our moderator, Jeff Y. Jeff, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Dana. Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you to Maine Chamber and all of our sponsors. As Dana's indicated, we're here to talk about 5G and the deployment of 5G. And obviously, Maine has some unique challenges. It's a very rural state, although it has many urban areas as well. So we'll be talking about that deployment of 5G in both rural and urban areas. We'll talk about the technological and economic benefits of 5G. And lastly, we'll also address sort of the good public policy goals to encourage and deploy 5G. But maybe before we start talking with or speaking with our panelists, we'll do a quick video that sort of highlights some of the benefits of 5G.
5G is the fifth generation of wireless. To understand it, you need to understand where it all began. First-generation wireless networks got us started with phone calls. Soon came text messaging, and eventually the mobile web. Then 4G got us video chatting, ride sharing, social networking, and using apps for just about everything. Like the generations that came before, 5G will change our lives in all sorts of unexpected ways. The first 5G networks are live across the country, and they'll continue to improve the coming years, becoming up to 100 times faster than today's 4G networks, putting high-speed broadband in the palm of your hand and allowing you to stream picture-perfect 4K video and download whatever you want, whenever you want, instantly. But faster speeds are just the start, because 5G will be 5 times more responsive than today's networks and will connect 100 times more devices. That means phones won't be the only smart wireless devices. 5G will connect us to our world in new and innovative ways. From driverless cars that communicate with each other to avoid accidents, to roads, buildings, bridges, and pipes telling us when they need repairs. Augmented reality applications that create new learning experiences, and new healthcare models such as patient monitoring and remote surgery. We're only just beginning to imagine the possibilities. That's 5G, coming to everything near you.
As Dana indicated, we have some excellent panelists today who are expert in wireless deployment, in wireless technology, and wireless policymaking. First, we have from Verizon, Sanjay Udani. He's a technologist who serves as vice president for policy at Verizon, where he develops and coordinates Verizon's policy positions on emerging services and technologies, including 5G, cybersecurity, privacy, spectrum, and supply chain security. Sanjay frequently represents Verizon in meetings with US and foreign government officials and frequently speaks at major industry events. Prior to joining Verizon's public policy team, Sanjay was a lead network architect for Verizon's Fios consumer broadband service. Sanjay earned his PhD in computer information science at the University of Pennsylvania, where he later served as an adjunct professor, teaching graduate courses at the engineering school for 13 years. Next, we have Beth Cooley. Beth is Assistant VP, State Legislative Affairs at CTIA. At CTIA, Beth is responsible for monitoring, advocating on legislation of import to the wireless industry in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Her legislative priority areas include the siting of wireless infrastructure, including next-gen wireless infrastructure, 5G, mobile broadband, and policies encouraging the deployment of smart communities. Beth is a graduate of Western New England University in Springfield, Mass., where she earned a BA in International Studies. She also holds a master's in public international affairs from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Lastly, we have Kimberly Darren. Kimberly is a assistant VP of public policy at AT&T, where she is responsible for developing AT&T's public policy positions and coordinating advocacy support for AT&T on wireless competition and regulatory issues at the federal, state, and local level. Prior to joining AT&T, she worked at the U.S. Congress, serving as a communications director for 2 members of the House of Representatives and as press secretary for the House Committee on Agriculture. Kimberly has a bachelor's degree in political science and journalism from the University of Arizona. Please join me in welcoming these 3 distinguished speakers. First place that we should maybe start is with Sanjay and talk a little bit about how maybe the contrasting of where we were at 4G and 3G, and now we are today at 5G, and sort of how that jump is going to benefit consumers.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me join this great panel. So the video kind of hinted at that, but if you think about how we've evolved since the days of 2G and 3G and 4G, from a physical perspective, as a customer, we didn't really see that many differences. It was the same old 200-foot tall towers that you see in lots of places, or you see antennas on top of buildings. And of course, our devices evolved, right? So from the days of 3G, where we had Blackberries, we now have our smartphones, the iPhone and so on. But the main difference between those days to 4G was just basically speed, right? So now you can start watching streaming videos on your mobile device, and most of us do when we're just doing nothing. With 5G, it's a little bit different. So it's 5G is not one thing. In my mind, I would think of it as 4 different things, and that's part of the reason why I think there's some confusion about, when people say, well, it's not one 5G, right? So I'll kind of walk through the 4 different things that I consider to be 5G, and I'll try to highlight sort of what makes them special, right? So the first one is just 5G as a successor to 4G, where you now get slightly faster speeds. So instead of maybe 20 megabits, you get 30, 40, 50 megabits per second. This is sort of the nationwide deployment that AT&T, Verizon have, and it's great, right? I mean, it works with all your latest devices, but it's not all that different in terms of the new services it enables. The second thing is starting to be a bit more interesting is what we call 5G ultra wideband, and others call similar names. This is where we now assign a whole bunch more spectrum, and we also build out a whole bunch more small cells. Now these are not your macro towers, the 200-foot towers. These are small cells that sit on lampposts or on attached to poles, or even building sides. What this does is that in a dense environment where you have a lot of customers, it now enables thousands of devices to connect at very high speeds. We're talking hundreds of megabits, if not, gigabit or more. And so this is something that we've started deploying in a whole bunch of cities. But as you can imagine, since you have to build out a whole bunch of small cells, it takes some time. The third thing, and this is where in my mind it gets really interesting, is because of some of these ultra wideband type deployments, we now have the capability to offer fixed wireless access. And this to me is really interesting because now we're talking for the first time real competition for cable or fiber to the home, because with fixed wireless, which we currently have, I believe, in 57 odd cities, you can now get speeds that are comparable to fiber or cable, performance that is essentially the same, and yet you don't have to now run fiber or cable to each individual home. You basically just put in a base station in the house and you're done. And then the last part is what I call 5G advanced. And that's the one that gets a lot of the buzz, but it's the hardest to do. And what I mean by that is that with 5G advanced, we're talking about things like the mobile edge compute, network slicing, all of the buzzwords that you might have heard. It is a completely new network. It's a completely new way of thinking about the network. And it's also the hardest to deploy. A lot of the standards for that are still being worked out. And so from a network perspective, that's still very much work in progress. From an equipment perspective, your standard smartphone is probably not going to benefit as much from it yet. Even if you have iPhone 12, iPhone 13, it'll work with the ultra wideband and other things. But as far as the virtual reality capabilities, augmented reality that 5G Advanced will bring, you need additional devices, right? Things like the VR, the virtual reality headsets, those sorts of things, which are also very much work in progress. And so for the more advanced part of 5G to really take hold, we need not just the network to be ready, but we need the hardware, the consumer hardware to be ready. We need the software and the architecture to be ready. So you might have heard about Facebook talking about the metaverse, or if you saw the movie Ready Player One, right? Immersive environments. All of that is where 5G is really going to shine. But it's also the most difficult thing to do. And so that's where it's going to take longer to get out rather than just your standard broadband deployment.
Well, thank you, Sanjay. As you talk about sort of this increased capacity that we're going to have with 5G, Beth, maybe you could comment a little bit about how 5G would support with that, increased capacity, economic growth, both in the U.S. and throughout Maine.
Sure, yes. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you to the Chamber for including CTIA. I thought, in addition to talking about 5G and its incredible benefits, it's important to first level set on the prevalence of wireless in Maine. Obviously, COVID has been, a powerful reminder of the importance of connectivity, and the fact that we're having this event remotely speaks to that. Nearly overnight, COVID prompted sudden and significant changes in how we live, work, and educate our kids. It's been over a year, since COVID was declared a national emergency, and America's wireless networks rose to the occasion. handling an unprecedented surge in mobile voice and data traffic almost overnight. And the reason why we were able to accommodate that change in traffic is because of the massive amount of investment that CTIA members make into their wireless networks. Just some tidbits. We love our stats at CTIA, so I got to throw out a few. Since 2016, wireless companies have invested nearly $140 billion nationwide to improve speeds, coverage, and quality. But over the life of the wireless industry, capital investment now totals over $600 billion. In Maine specifically, the wireless industry contributes over $1 billion to the state's GDP every year. And this is noteworthy because almost over half, of Maine households are wireless only. So, with nearly half of Maine households wireless only, it begs the question, what are folks using their devices for? Well, of course, you can still make phone calls with your device. The demand for mobile data has proven insatiable in recent years. And Jeff, this is going to, speak to your question about capacity and congestion on our networks. Again, throwing out another stat, because CTIA loves our numbers, we have an annual wireless survey, and we found that last year's data shows another record of mobile wireless data traffic. That's topping 42 trillion megabytes, which is a approximately 207% increase since 2016. So over the past decade, Americans have driven a 108-time increase in mobile data traffic. That is a lot of data. So obviously, with this public health emergency forcing everyone online all at once, it has highlighted just how important it is for wireless communications to be reliable, fast, and prepared to handle that increased demand. So with that, that's where 5G comes into play. Sanjay did a great job explaining what is 5G. It's going to accommodate this congestion, this demand on our networks. So, you probably hear often in the commercials, the most sexy part about 5G is that, it's going to be 100 times faster than today's 4G networks. That will make it a great backbone for bandwidth intensive technologies like AR, VR, high resolution images and videos. But 5G is also going to serve 100 times more devices than today's 4G networks, which means that the Internet of Things can connect a vast array of previously unconnected objects, from streetlights and trash cans to parking meters and crops. And then finally, there's this issue of latency or responsiveness of 5G networks, which Sanjay also touched on. The latency, which is the time between data receiving and sending, will be reduced by 5 times with 5G, which makes it especially well suited for mission critical communications like in areas like telemedicine, public safety, and first response. It's also a very exciting economic development time with 5G. It's important to note these enormous benefits that will be coming into states and localities due to 5G deployments. A recent Boston Consulting Group report estimates that over the next decade, 5G deployments will contribute 1.5 trillion to the US GDP and create 4.5 million new jobs. In Maine specifically, BCG, Boston Consulting Group, estimates that nearly $3 billion will be contributed to Maine's GDP, and over 8,500 jobs will be created in the next decade. Now, if I may, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about, some verticals or sectors that will be impacted by 5G. But, truly, our benefits are only limited by our imagination. I mean, every industry, including healthcare, energy, transportation, law enforcement, e-commerce, logistics, education, will all be positively impacted by 5G. So I just want to talk about a few. I think probably top of mind, we're talking about, we're in Maine. I also come from a rural state and spent most of the pandemic in a rural area, and healthcare was very important to me while also being safe. And so, I don't know about the rest of the folks tuning in today, but I personally had numerous telehealth check-ins with my various providers throughout this pandemic. And 5G technology will further enhance these services through remote patient monitoring, you saw a little bit in the video, and even remote surgery through connected healthcare devices. Deloitte did a report and they estimated that this type of healthcare remote monitoring could generate $305 billion in healthcare savings every year. Now, I think, regardless of what side of the debate you may find yourself on with respect to healthcare, we can all agree that $305 billion in savings is a big deal. Smart cities, this is another exciting area of connectivity for 5G. Wireless powered smart city solutions will deliver $160 billion in benefits and savings through things like lower energy use and less congestion. Sensors will monitor the health and safety of critical infrastructure like buildings, roads, and bridges, while connected trash cans, bus stops, light poles, and more will help cities operate more efficiently. And then finally, the last thing I'd like to highlight is education. Nearly overnight, everyone had to move to remote work and remote learning. And 5G will give students expanded opportunities to learn through immersive applications like VR, virtual reality, AR, augmented reality, thanks to the lower latency of 5G networks. And so that's just the tip of the iceberg with respect to some of the sectors or verticals that may be impacted by 5G. But then that begs the question, and Jeff, I don't mean to steal your segue, but how do we get there? What infrastructure and policies do we need in place? And I think, Kimberly's going to do a great job talking about that, but that's where I am right now. So thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Beth. And indeed, that's a perfect segue, right? In Maine, where we have 50% of users being wireless only, I'm sure Kimberly has some good ideas about what good public policy could be put into place to help expedite the deployment of 5G. So Kimberly?
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Dana and the Chamber. AT&T is very excited to be here today. And yeah, so Sanjay talked a little bit about the technology powering 5G, and Beth talked about the consumer and economic benefits. And we're going to talk a little bit about policies, right? Because if we can't upgrade our networks to 5G, then we can't provide consumers the services that they want and need. And there really are few public policy issues that impact the provision of wireless service more directly or more profoundly than wireless infrastructure siting. We can't turn these networks on like a light switch, right? We can't cover 100% of every square mile overnight. It takes new physical infrastructure in cities and towns across the state and across the county. And 5G, as Sanjay noted, takes less infrastructure around large towers and more our ability to install hundreds of thousands of small cells. And the ideal place for these small cells is the public right-of-way, where sidewalks, electric, and light utilities are located. So even though consumers are demanding faster speeds and newer technologies, deploying small cells can be pretty complex and pretty costly. Unfortunately, states and cities across the states don't always have consistent regulations and ordinances around issues like access to the right-of-way or how to attach small cells to utility poles and municipal infrastructures, or even the application and permitting processes for small cells. And wireless facilities require extensive permitting. Depending on the jurisdiction, this can include building permits, electrical permits, traffic and encroachment permits, among others. So this leaves us as the provider left to navigate a really complicated and inconsistent patchwork of local regulations and ordinances. And sometimes that's on a city by city or even pole by pole basis. And then on top of that, many localities, unfortunately, enact restrictive ordinances that make it even more difficult and expensive to build out our networks, including prohibiting pole attachments or imposing moratoria on the placement of small cells and delaying lease renewals. All of these create barriers to deployment of 5G. They create additional cost and expense, which are unfortunately are passed along to consumers, and they deter investment in the state. So in order to bring the benefits of 5G that Beth talked about, we need policies at all levels of government to facilitate infrastructure deployment. One of the best and most efficient ways we've been able to address some of the barriers at the local level is really through statewide legislation, which can help to streamline the application and permitting process, grant access to the rights of way, and adopt reasonable fees for access to those rights of way and infrastructure. And state legislation has been proven to be both reasonable and workable in more than 30 states over the last few years. And that includes here in Maine, right, which passed LD 1517 in 2019, making small cells a permitted use in the right of way and requiring that they be treated like everything else in the right of way. So smart policies like this can lead to increased investment and faster deployment of next generation services. Because absent reform, regulatory costs of obtaining these approvals can actually exceed the cost of deploying the small cell. The FCC actually stepped in a couple years ago to modernize its own rules and remove some of the regulatory barriers at the local level that were inhibiting deployment of wireless infrastructure. In 2018, the FCC issued 3 orders: a small cell order, moratoria, and a one-touch make-ready order. And these orders clarified the local authority to deny or delay access to poles for 5G and the limits on those, as well as broadband build-out. And these orders were challenged in the Ninth Circuit. Last year, the courts unanimously upheld all aspects of the Commission's orders relating to pole attachment rates and deployment on utility poles. And the court also found that specific local restrictions on wireless siting are preempted by the Communications Act. So those orders have now been litigated and they serve as the final word. So smart public policies that create some regulatory certainty, like the FCC orders and the statewide small cell legislation, can facilitate deployment and more quickly bring the benefits of 5G to our communities, because we know that capital flows where it's treated best. And Beth covered it, but I think it's worth reiterating that wireless companies will invest $275 billion to build out our 5G networks, creating new jobs and contributing to the economy. That $275 billion for 5G is on top of the $600 billion the industry invested in our network over the life of the industry, as technology has evolved and how people are using technology in a different way. And if ever there was an example of how good policy drives investment, I'll leave you with these 2 points. And I took these from CTA because they love their facts. In the 2 years following implementation of the FCC's siting reforms, more cell sites were built than the previous 7 years combined. And the last year alone, in 2020, wireless carriers invested $30 billion in our networks. That's a 5-year high and the 3rd straight year of increasing capital expenditures to power our wireless networks. So to make sure that the cities have access to the mobile networks they need to keep consumers connected and stay ahead of the curve, now more than ever, policymakers should be exploring ways to encourage rather than impede investment so we can bring the latest technologies and services to Mainers and consumers across the country as quickly as possible. So Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions.
Well, thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Beth, and thank you, Sanjay. Well, I'm enjoying my conversation with all of you. I also want to invite the audience to submit questions to you via the chat. So I assume many of you know how, but just click onto the chat button on the bottom and you can submit a question. I'll be monitoring those questions and submitting to the panelists. But maybe to lead things off, let's talk a little bit about Maine's, Connect Maine's definition of broadband. And it has symmetrical speeds of 100 up and 100 down megabits per second. The question really is, does that make sense for wireless? And maybe, Sanjay, do you want to talk a little bit about the Connect Maine definition of broadband that's symmetrical 100 megabits per second, and how maybe wireless providers think about that?
Sure. Happy to discuss that. And I would address it not just from a wireless perspective, but also from a wireline perspective. So I worked on our FiOS architecture since 2005. And what we've seen in terms of the usage statistics, whether you're talking about wireless or wireline, is that we tend to consume a lot more traffic. In other words, the downstream tends to be a lot higher than the upstream. And this is including the past year and a half with the pandemic, where we're all doing lots of video calls like we're doing right now. The ratios we typically see are between 8-to-1 or to 12-to-1 down, which means, so for example, if you're consuming 100 megabits down to your home, typically you're using about 10 megabits up, 10-to-1 ratio. And so that's the way networks tend to be designed to account for the usage by consumers. Now, as the usage evolves, we would of course adapt the network. So I'll use our cellular service as an example, right? We've increased the speeds both on the downstream and upstream over time as the usage increased. If we started with symmetric from day one, what would happen is you would basically over-engineer the network. In other words, you'd be spending more effort and cost on a part of a network that doesn't need it. And so in effect, you're now slowing down a deployment. So I would see it as a, yes, you could do a symmetric service. You can do that asymmetric with wireless. You can do it with wireline, whatever. The question is, do you need to? And our usage statistics from the past, 10, 15, 20 years show us that that's just not a requirement for the vast majority of consumers.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay, about that. Beth or Kimberly, do you want to add anything about that? Symmetrical services. It sounds like it's not sort of the best use of dollars, that consumers don't necessarily need symmetrical services. Beth, I know you represent many of these carriers. You have thoughts about that?
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff, for the question. We looked, CTIA did, at independent data from OpenSignal on internet usages pre-COVID and post-COVID. And as Sanjay just outlined, it is overwhelmingly downstream. So the habits actually haven't changed. And as I discussed, wireless networks were more than up to the challenge during the COVID shift, if you will. We fared much better than other parts of the world, candidly, and our internet speeds actually went up. But in terms of symmetrical speeds, that does not reflect actual usage, and potentially could preclude a cheaper and faster to market solution like wireless if such a policy were pursued. So again, it doesn't actually reflect what consumers are doing at home, whether it's recreational and you're streaming, or I'm doing this from home right now, Zoom conference calls. So we would urge any policymakers tuning in to be very cautious, and you don't want to preclude or foreclose, I should say, a solution that is fast to market, generally cheaper, and covers more consumers at the end of the day.
Kimberly, do you have anything that you would like to add?
Just to say that I agree 100% with Beth and Sanjay. A mandated standard, especially one like 100 over 100, requires fiber build out, right? And not every location can have fiber. So, as far as supporting standards, we don't want to inadvertently limit options or available solutions to customers, right? That just delays getting service to the people who need it most. So as Sanjay and Beth noted, we really just want to make sure we're not inadvertently leaving out or removing the opportunity to provide service using other technologies.
One thing I would add, Kimberly, is it's not just a question of fiber can support symmetric and wireless can't. I mean, we just demonstrated about a week and a half ago that we could do 700 plus megabits per second upstream on our 5G connection. So could you offer symmetric at some point? You could on wireless as well. It's a question of what is the cost of doing that compared to using that resources to now support more customers or more things.
That's a good point, right? And if you can deploy it, how long is it going to take? And once it is available, are consumers going to want to pay for it, right?
Right, exactly.
So interestingly, we got a question from Nate, and he wants to know about sort of the biggest struggle for paying more 5G in Maine. That was actually going to be my question because, look, I come from Massachusetts. When I was a commissioner in Massachusetts, surprisingly, there's a lot of rural parts of Massachusetts, and we had a lot of struggles of deploying there. So I think what folks probably want to hear, not just about how urban deployment is going to happen in Maine, how is rural deployment going to happen in Maine? And maybe, I don't know, Beth, you start off because, again, you're covering many carriers and have sort of a broader vision, and then maybe Kimberly and Sanjay can go next from their own company's point of view.
Sure, Jeff, thank you. That's a great question. I think it's important to know, while small cells, as Kimberly discussed, deployed in the right of way are very important for 5G. In more rural cases, such as Maine, it's important to remember that macro towers, those 200-foot towers that you see along the side of the highway, those will also be used to provide 5G. And so, to the extent that there is a regulatory framework that has clear processes, whether it's timelines, shot clocks, so that when a provider comes in and submits an application to add an antenna to a macro tower, for example, to provide 5G, they know what the rules of the road are. The locality knows what the rules of the road are. So we know we'll submit this application, we'll get a response in this amount of time. It's going to cost us this much money. And the same will be true for small cells as well, just so that we have a regulatory environment where we know what to expect. I do know today from one CTIA member that there is 5G in Maine. In particular, they have 8 sites in Washington County alone on their macro towers. So it is, 5G is alive and well in Maine right now, but there are hurdles, and the topography and obviously the rural nature, it can be a challenge. But again, if there are clear rules of the road so that everyone knows how the process works, that will ultimately help the consumer at the end of the day.
That's great. Kimberly, does AT&T have some views about how 5G deployment is going to happen in Maine?
I mean, the challenges are, as I think we've all discussed, is that those greater distances and lower density make it hard, even prohibitive sometimes, to finance that broadband infrastructure in rural areas, right? And so we're looking at all possible options in our toolkit. And Sanjay talked a little bit about it. I imagine he will as soon as I turn it over to him, but fixed wireless is one possible option that we don't want to dismiss, right? The one thing that I would want to emphasize here is because the performance of fixed wireless internet can be affected by different factors like terrain, foliage usage. We just want to make sure the policymakers should ensure that any performance standards or requirements for especially government funded deployments should be flexible so that we don't limit those available technologies. So Sanjay, do you want to talk a little bit more about fixed wireless?
Sure, I'm happy to do. So, just putting my engineer hat on, one thing I would say, and this is true for Maine as is with any other places, when we're designing a network, whether it was, the FiOS network or whether it's 5G, it's a really complicated, difficult thing to do just from an engineering perspective. And so the fewer restrictions and limitations and barriers you can put up from a non-engineering perspective, the better it is for us to design the network and build it out well. So I'll just make that as a general statement, just to support what Beth and Kimberly just said, that the more limitations we have on how we can put small cells, where we can put them, how quickly we can put them, all of those things have an impact on how we design the network. And then when it comes to fixed wireless, absolutely, I think it is a much faster way of deploying broadband compared to some of the more traditional methods. And honestly, if we had that option back in 2003, when I first started designing the fiber to the home network, I'm not sure that we would have done fiber alone. We would have probably done a combination, just because the amount of flexibility it gives you. And so I think it's the engineering is hard enough. Try not to add more, burdens to the design. That would be my summary of it.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Another question in the chat is there's a couple of questions about RF. And I know the FCC has addressed RF and the safety of RF. As probably Beth and Kimberly and Sanjay know, I also represent carriers and deployment and small cells, and many times communities have these questions. So Beth, can you address how the FCC has addressed RF and how they've decided what is safe and what it makes sense?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question. And, I just want to be clear, CTIA is not a scientific agency. I'm not a scientist. We defer to those that are. On this topic, unfortunately, there is a great deal of misinformation out there. And, that's the society that we live with, Facebook research, with all due respect to our Facebook friends out there. But we have to look to the experts on this, the global experts who have been studying non-ionizing radiation, which is what wireless emits, and the consensus among the health experts, which includes the American Cancer Society, the World Health Organization, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, is that the weight of scientific evidence shows no known adverse health effects to humans from exposure to wireless antennas or devices. And that's ultimately, where CTIA, ends up. We follow what the experts say. They've been studying this for decades. And that's ultimately where they are. You can check out the FCC's website. And I know that some folks, maybe I can see in the chat, are bringing up the DC Circuit opinion from the US Court of Appeals. And what that decision did was basically said that on the FCC's RF rules, that they did not fully explain their conclusions. And so again, if you read the opinion from the DC Circuit, I'll read you some quotes. We find that the commission offered an adequate explanation for its determination that exposure to RF radiation at levels below the commission's current limits do not cause cancer. They also say, to be clear, we take no position in the scientific debate regarding the health and environmental effects of RF radiation. So I know that that is top of mind and folks are talking about it, but nothing has changed. And again, we are deferring to the health experts in this space.
Well, thank you, Beth. I think that helps many of us understand, again, I'm not a scientist, I'm a lawyer, but I think it's really good to look at experts and well-regarded experts when we talk about these questions. Maybe that's tied to all this is sort of this wireless versus fiber question. And I know, Sanjay, you touched upon this. I know you talked about, fixed wireless technology for home users or office users. Do you want to talk a little bit about this fiber? I know it's been sort of fiber versus wireless and how a wireless deployment can be economic, make a lot of economic sense. Go ahead, Sanjay.
Sure. So, I'm a huge proponent of fiber, right? I mean, I was one of the lead architects of our fiber to the home network. So I'm, absolutely in favor of fiber. And if you look at a cellular network, the vast majority of a cellular network, I'd say 99.99% of it is actually fiber, because the only part that is wireless is between your mobile device and the small cell or the cell tower. The rest of it typically is going to be fiber. So very much in favor of fiber. However, when we're talking about large scale deployments, especially when we're trying to do something meaningful, in a short period of time, you want to look not at the technology used, you want to look at what's the use case, what are the requirements first, and what technologies can we use to meet those requirements as quickly as possible. And so it's not a question of fiber is bad or fiber is good. Fiber is great, but deploying it takes a long time compared to some of the other technologies. And I'll give you one example. And again, this is a Verizon specific one, but I think it applies to probably AT&T and others too. We started deploying fiber to the home in 2005. And in 2021, we have roughly 18 million homes passed. We started deploying fixed wireless access in 2018. And by the end of this year, we expect to have 15 million homes passed. By the end of 2025, we'll have roughly 50 million home passed. So you can just see the difference in the deployment speeds. And so to me, that's a big deal, especially when both technologies can support the use cases that consumers need right now.
Well, that's great. Beth, do you want to add anything about sort of this fiber wireless, question? I know many think, and as Sanjay, who was very involved in fiber deployment, has said, fiber is great, but also we have to think about how wireless deployment can sort of work hand in hand with a fiber deployment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just reiterate my previous point is that, there are many tools in the toolkit for, closing the digital divide, getting broadband to everyone. And it's very important not to foreclose wireless, particularly in areas with difficult topography or very rural areas, because it's important to remember we can get a solution faster to market and cheaper for the consumer and cover more households at the end of the day.
Kimberly, anything you would like to add about that?
The only thing I would add is exactly what Beth just said, right? Our focus is on getting service, a very good system faster to serve more Mainers sooner, right? Fiber is great, as Sanjay said, as Beth said, right? But we want to be able to use whatever technologies we can to bring those services to Mainers into the country as fast as we can. And we don't want any of those services to be precluded.
So maybe, Kimberly, you spoke a lot about sort of the barrier to sort of regulation and ordinances that sort of prevent this deployment of wireless. What other kind of barriers should policymakers in Maine think about? I know pole attachments is something that's very important to folks, especially if you're doing a small cell deployment. Can you think of some other things that we should highlight for folks as they think about, removing barriers, making deployment much easier?
Sure, and I touched on this a little bit, but I think local officials and leaders can really help to facilitate the deployment and bring those services quicker to the consumers, and help us prepare our networks to accommodate those future technologies by streamlining the permitting process, right? Establishing universal master leasing agreements for small cells, and even ensuring those full attachment rates and fees are reasonable. So those are kind of the three areas that we really focus on when we're communicating with local leaders and officials on what they can best do to help kind of pave the way for quicker and faster deployment of those services.
Beth, how about you, from your sort of national perspective, anything that you're seeing sort of nagging and hindering wireless deployment?
It's the same song and dance, Jeff, if you will. I mean, what I'm seeing nationwide, particularly, as we're working on state and local ordinances to streamline wireless facilities generally, I have heard CTI members, publicly testify that, they have to plan their capital budgets many, many, many years in advance. And there's a limited bucket. And I will say, in one locality, for example, their investment may not be welcomed because of incredible burdensome ordinances, or sometimes localities will outsource to consultants, which is fine, to help with siting, because it can be a very technical area, and that's understandable. But when these consultants, for example, operate on a contingency fee basis, and then a wireless provider has to pay that out of pocket, I have heard CTI members publicly testify and say, listen, I've got limited capital, I'm going to take it somewhere else, because it's just too hard to build, it's too expensive, it's too lengthy, and I need, to Kimberly's point, to get my product to market. Our customers need this, they're asking for this. So that's sort of what I've seen nationwide, is in fact states and localities competing with one another, which is great, because at the end of the day, we want to help our customers have the most advanced and enhanced wireless services for policymakers tuning in. We want your constituents to have the best experiences. I mean, I think if anything, what this pandemic has shown us is that, I don't know what our new normal looks like. Maybe it's a hybrid where, we're working from home, we're schooling from home, some days of the week, or, whatever it is. And again, the importance of connectivity could not be more important. And at the end of the day, we are part of the solution.
Well, thank you, Beth. Sanjay, anything to add about some barriers that you've seen across the nation, or any other, your place in your conversations internationally?
No, so I mean, as far as, I think I would echo what Kimberly and Beth said. I just kind of, as you guys were talking, it kind of reminds me of back in the fiber to the home FiOS days. We had similar pushback, right? So we had neighborhoods and counties and cities kind of pushing back on allowing fiber deployment, fiber to the home deployment, or sort of the next generation broadband deployment. Because at that point, people just thought, well, why do I need this? And I just sense that we're in the same position now where, 5 years after the fact, it'll be obvious why you need it. But then it's too late, right? It takes many years to deploy these things. And so it's sort of the same story in some sense.
Well, thank you. Well, we're really approaching the top of the hour. I want to maybe give one more moment for our audience to add any questions to the chat. I think we've addressed all the questions there so far. But maybe a closing thought about Maine and sort of any specific Maine benefits that you could see, either Kimberly or Sanjay, from your company's perspective, by having more 5G deployment.
I don't have a Maine specific thing, but I think this applies to Maine and other places. I always think about this quote attributed to these technologies named Roy Amare. And he said that we tend to overestimate the impact of a technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And I think that's absolutely true for 5G, right? You see a lot of hype and people are kind of going, well, what's the big deal? I don't really need it. And we just, built it up a lot. But I think the longer term impact of 5G is just going to be, almost unimaginable for us right now.
And Kimberly, I'll give you maybe the last word.
Thank you. And I would just add, and I appreciate Dana starting out the call talking about some of the unique features of Maine, right? It's bigger than the size of the Northeast. It's the most rural state in the nation. And I think there are unique challenges to the state of Maine, right, that we need to be mindful of. And so I think from our perspective, what we want to do is really partner with local officials and state officials at all levels of government and and work together to try and build out these networks. Beth and Sanjay said it, right? Our consumers, Mainers want these services, right? And so we just need to partner together to get those networks upgraded and built out so that we can bring 5G to Maine as quickly as possible.
And I should allow you, Beth, to say one last comment. I forgot. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, they're on the ground. I think what's exciting in Maine, obviously unique situation, in terms of what sector, what silo, I don't think we know. Whether, again, it's schooling from home, it's, it's crops, it's ag, it's smart communities. I think it's really exciting. I'm very interested to see what's going to happen with healthcare. Obviously, particularly more rural areas. I think that remote surgery is really exciting in the future. Again, saving time from having to get in your car, drive to a doctor, take time off of work. Just those logistical things that you don't think about that are going to be real time savers to you. So I think there's a lot of exciting applications, and I can't wait to see what's coming.
Well, thank you. Well, join me in thanking Sanjay, Kimberly, and Beth. Thank you, guys. I would like to hand it back off to Dana to close out the program, but thank you again, Sanjay, Kimberly, and Beth.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you. And thank you for being our moderator today on this very informative session that we've just had for the past hour. I too want to thank Sanjay, Beth, and Kimberly for providing the type of information that I think that we all need to better understand the options available to us. Our sponsors are critical. AT&T and Verizon, Central Maine Power, MEMIC, and Eaton Peabody are all important for us to be able to provide this type of program, but also the option that's available to our state. I think I said it at the outset, but clearly broadband is a priority that's on everybody's list these days, from our government to the private sector. We also have come to realize that there probably isn't one option that's going to satisfy every need. So programs like this and like the ones we've had in the past is intended to bring the options to you to better understand what's there, but to also recognize, as we have today, the role, the impact, and the promise of each of these options, like 5G wireless option provides us. Our panelists left us with little doubt as to its value and its place in addressing the broadband deployment. Also, what needs to be done, policies, investments, meeting the challenges that are out there, and the many opinions that people have to be able to reach the potential that 5G offers. So again, I thank everyone that was a part of this program. And again, it's an important program for everybody to hear, and we'll be sure, and as well as see, and we'll be sure to post this on our website so that more will be able to understand what you shared with us today. Again, thank you so very much. We certainly appreciate it.